Yes, Ethiopian greetings. Salamta, Tena Istalin. Salamta, Tena Istalin. Rastafari, Wandamoche, Hitoche. Yes, his bay, my people, my people. Now, you might judge by the title and think like, what? Hey, what is the brother talking about? Rastafari movement, right? Movement, Rastafari, movement or inertia. Is it a movement or inertia? You know, when a movement stops moving, like this is like basic science and basic like physics. You can kind of look this up about inertia, right? Look up inertia and movement. You know, like a moving, something that's moving, like it's moving in one direction. Because it's moving, it can easily move in another direction. You know, because it's moving, you know, that movement can continue moving. Right? It doesn't always have to move like in a linear way, but it can continue movement because the movement itself, right? But the hardest thing to do is to get out of like inertia. Like inertia is like when something is not moving, you know? So there's movement versus inertia. So look into that, more of that. You know, I'm just doing this off of the dome, you know, my brothers and sisters, but something that we have reasoned on and we have kind of dialogued on, you know, with the twos and threes, you know how it goes right there. But as we begin to view what the Almighty is showing us, you know, like in this present time, our Godfather, the reality, you know, what's real, you know, and with social media, especially like social media has a very interesting effect, you know, on things. And I'm not against social media, of course, you know, many of y'all know I because of social media, so it's not speaking about that, you know, but within that, of course, you know, we as the viewers, you know, we have to have a sense of discernment, you know. And there's another vid I like to touch on, another very important subject matter, somewhat related to this, but I'm going to touch on the Rastafari subject matter. But there's another subject matter concerning like black people generally, but Black America, and a lot of this kind of diverse doctrine that's like a kind of a COINTELPRO, you know, a lot of like the FBAism, you know, the FBAism, you know, the FBA. So I got to touch on this because a lot want to not really focus on that right there. They're getting caught up in the hype, and it's like a COINTELPRO. I don't know what number to call it, you know. One might say 2.0, but I think it's past the 2.0, 3.0. And we're not talking about the old-fashioned COINTELPRO. We're talking about what it stands for, right? And Rastafari, right? Rastafari, the real movement that comes out of Ethiopia. See, the origin of the Rastafari movement is Ethiopia. Jamaica does play a very, very important part, right? But as we pointed to even in our vid about the Rastafarites, right? So we're not, you know, we still are on that. We still are on that particular subject matter. You know, we're still on that particular subject matter. All right, hold on for a moment, right? Yeah, so the divide and conquer, you know, the divide and conquer is real, right? What Babylon feel like? Called, chosen, faithful, Rastafari, I and I be Israelites. See, it all really comes together. It really does come together. Yeah, my brothers and sisters, it does come together. Yeah. So the Rastafari movement and the inertia. See, so inertia is when you stop moving, right? This is why I mentioned before, you know, we've been focusing more like on, when we talk about the Lion of Judah, the community, and also the greater Rastafari community. Because we're like a man, we'll be like what they would call a mansion, right, as Rastafari. A Black American mansion, because it comes from this, up from the soil, up here, right, this North Country, where the Rastafarites, you know, and the Rastafarites, do your history on the Rastafarites, you know, like Chicago. Brother Sifaway, you know, he has a lot of very good Balanta, a lot of very good research out there we pointed to in our other video, you know, about, you know, the first Rasta, right? Is it the first Rasta or Rastafari, right? The man, Rastafari, a.k.a. Kedamari Haile Selassie, I Godfather, you know, and King of Kings, you know, conquering line of the tribe of Judah, Kedamari Haile Selassie, you know, elect of God, King of Kings of Ethiopia, right? But even before coronation, because if you go onto social media and you go do some research, The popular view is that Rastafari emerged in 1930 with the coronation of Edamawi Haile Selassie, or the one known prior to as Rastafari Mekonnen, aka Rastafari Makanen, as the English speakers would generally say, right? But that movement there, when we talk about the real movement, was because of the light that shined from Ethiopia, right, from the east to the west, as the coming of the Son of Man, that man-child would be, according to, scriptural biblical prophecy. But here, this is not to get into those aspects. So that's the background. I want you to understand the historical and the prophetic background of our ancestors and elders. Then we can really trace where we're at today. Because all from there, we have movement upon movement upon movement upon movement. We have the movement moving, right? You know what I'm saying? All right. But somewhere along the line, we've gotten to a state of inertia, right? Inertia. And inertia means the movement's not moving. In fact, if you go around social media, you really don't hear a few ones still nostalgically speak about, the Rastafari movement. It's like, we as black people, when we talk about the black community, some people will continue to talk about the black community, but the honest truth of the matter is that there are probably black communities, right? But overall, what used to be called the black community doesn't exist, right? What we have is black neighborhoods. We live in black neighborhoods, here and there. Now, this kind of doves, with my other subject matter, and I don't want to even give it away right here, but I want to focus on this particular message here, like a brief message. What do you think, brothers and sisters? Give some comments on it as well, and also share your own thoughts. We hope that other brothers and sisters, can give their testimonies as well, because this is the part of, where the voice of justice, as His Majesty, right, speaks on. Let's bring this up right here. In our research, we got this here. Let me see if we can get this. Right. Is that, what page is going on there? That's a block. Okay, they're on the propaganda. Yeah, we looked up something on propaganda. Right? So here, Haile Selassie Admiral Haile Selassie, he viewed information as a vital tool, right, for political development. Right? Did you check out our video on black, the real origin of black, and how black referred not so much to racial in the sense of white supremacy, racism, and white supremacy, but more to a political, right? It had political significance. But of course, that also has been lost. It reminded me of what the scripture talks about, generation gap. Bob Marley and the Wailers, there's a tune where they speak about the generation gap, right? And scripture also, in a sense, speaks about generation gap. But if you study sociology among people, sometimes there's a generation gap, Sometimes the gap is between, like, the parent and the children. The parents, they're on what they're on. You know how children, when we're children, we hear, like, the music that our parents listen to, and we're like, ah. But then maybe later on, way later on, we begin to maybe even appreciate many of those things that our parents were about. We're like, wow, that was really good. When I was young, I used to love this. I really recognize how good music this is, how the message, I'm getting the message. So there's that kind of curve there as well, that kind of maturity, that growth and maturity curve. But His Majesty viewed information, right, as a vital tool for political development, asserting that a, quote, well-informed public opinion, right? You hear that? A well-informed public opinion. So one say, Ross, why are you doing this particular video? Yadin, what's up with this particular video? Well, this video here is to help with our well-informed public opinion as Rastafari, and as Rastafari, how can we say Rastafari related? Rastafari is a particular term that's often used. Rastafari inclined, those who have Rastafari inclination, maybe not Rastafari according to all the tenets here or there, but they have a kind of an inclination, right, to good vis-a-vis Rastafari and the Ethiopian, the Israelite, the Rastafari Israelite movements. I have to say it like that because, we don't want to get confused in all this kind of, diverse doctrine There's a lot of diverse doctrine that's going on. But a well-informed public opinion is essential for national progress, and especially the progress of any people, right? Because the whole question of nationality, this is a very important subject matter, black nationalism, and how does the Rastafari movement and black nationalism, what is black nationalism, when did it rise up? You know what I mean? And what happened to the unity across, the spectrum? There was one time that we could, when I say one time I'm talking about black people, when we study the history, and also we, value and document, the testimonies of those before us, because that informs us now. When we then compare, well, are we better off, as a people, as at this time? In one sense, we are on one level, because if we have a view like to being well informed, right, the history, and using this kind of social media technology to really, get serious about the information, right, information gathering and intelligence making, right? Let's see if we make this make sense, right? So we can view it in its true and most objective, right? And taking an objective perspective, because we can give personal testimonies, but they're good, right? But there's a certain objective perspective to the so-called big issues or the unifying issue, those things that really matter, right, to the majority, if not all of us. So while utilizing nationalist propaganda, so, people talk about propaganda and say, oh, well, propaganda, that's a bad thing. See, if we're thinking like a Gentile, one thing about the real Rastafari movement, none but yourselves can free your mind, right? It's about the mind, right? It's about education. It's about literacy. Because on social media, there's a lot of, how can we say, like I said, diverse doctrine, but there are those who are attempting, to be honest, for lack of a better word, disseminators of, or even honest brokers, of the truth, or disseminators of the truth, right? And even sometimes saying truths that many of our people don't want to take. We have our nostalgia, right? Or mythos. Mythos is important to any people, right? And people look down on so-called myths, right? But a lot of mythos and myths are basically simplifications, right, of great historic, and maybe even prophetic events that sometimes are kind of summed up, right, into what seems like a mythos. So, like, the weak, versus the strong. You know what I mean? That kind of David versus Goliath story. We have that with His Imperial Majesty. Clearly, a modern David versus Goliath. I mean, there's no other way around that, right? And then we see the history and the heritage, Ethiopian Hebrew and Judeo-Coptic heritage that kind of links us all the way back to a historical narrative that makes a direct connection, right? That's why we speak about the royal order of the Ethiopian Hebrews. This is why we talk about the Israelites of Ethiopia. That's the half of the story that in this social media doesn't get as much circulation or dissemination, right? And the public is not really well informed. They don't really have a good or a informed, and a factual kind of public opinion about it. So that means that every other development, whether it's political, or national, or economic, or social, or communal, right, is jeopardized by it. So when we talk about Rastafari, it's important for us to note, right, the fullness of Rastafari. So when we're speaking about, the Black Americans, I'm saying Black Americans, we're not saying FBA, right? We're talking about Black Americans, because this other thing is a diverse doctrine. This whole FBA thing is a diverse doctrine, right? And when we get into our, dissemination on whether asking the question of whether Black Americans, right, or Black people in America become tethered, right, to white America, whether they know it or not, they like it or not, a lot of it is about not our other brothers and sisters being tethers, right, but actually America, and how America, how the West was won. My father, my earthly, always used to say that about how people didn't know how West was won. I remember in the early Rastafari movement, when it still was a movement. I think the 90s is where things, I think the movement started to really fall into this inertia state, right? As we go from from say the martyrdom of ones like, the martyrdom of ones like Burhan Selassie, aka Bob Marley, Robert Nesta Marley, known as, Bob Marley, and what happened to Peter Tosh. These were foremost spokesmen and spokespersons of the Rastafari movement that at those times was still moving. So in the times of Bob Marley, Burhan Selassie, right, who many, and not many, some, there are some Israelites or Hebrew Israelites that speak disparagingly, because this is all part of, information about knowledge, the other half of the story. There's a lot of information that has been suppressed, even though there's a whole bunch of information on social media, right? The real information, the other half of the story has been suppressed. So when we're speaking about the Afro-American, or in modern language, the Black American, you could say roots of the Rastafari revelation in the West, this is often not disseminated when the popular Rastafari of Jamaica and Jamaican Rastafari matter is mentioned. Now people say, well, why are you saying this? It's a part of, is it not the truth or the truth that the first Rasta, aka Leonard Percival Howell, said that he got his tenets and he learned about the whole Rastafari and Rastafarites, right, and the Rastafari. In other words, what he brought to Jamaica was because of what he got here in these here United States, right? And this is why it is very important for us to speak on these things and articulate these things, right? And I give thanks to a few of the brothers and sisters. There's been a few posts, maybe there's been more than that, but to all those who have taken the video that we've posted on Rastafari Jews and have either posted elsewhere or some of the posts on Facebook, and share it, on their platforms, or even giving some of their own commentary, right, or critique, right, whether they agree or whether they disagree. Because it's part of the conversation that we need to have. Because one thing we can see about our ancestors is that because of how society and the world was, right, they got to even speak to each other. They got to communicate. They communicated. We think we communicate because of social media, right, but we really don't. That's why I don't want to make this video too long, because we know that, people, there's what they call attention, and the whole attention deficit, and there's so much going on right there, and you want to kind of keep it to this particular point, right? So we're touching on propaganda, right, because propaganda is important, but here's what he often warned against the destructive power, right, of inaction, right, not acting. It's like we say, like this video. If you're watching this video up to this point, like this video, share this video. If you haven't subscribed, then subscribe. You might return, hopefully, please do, or one might not, but that does give the platform a support. And some of y'all that might be checking out YouTube and you don't have your account, go into your account and just be able to like videos that you like. You know what I'm saying? These little things, these little steps really, really matter. Don't become a passive consumer of information. So you receive this information, you like it, you might then, take points and talk about it, and everything, but you're not really supporting the platform. There's not just one way, to support, the platform. There's many ways to support, the platform, and to support other platforms that you might be watching, and because sometimes people watch videos, they don't even like it. It's as simple as the easiest thing. And I've heard other content creators speak about that, and then I'm thinking this is true, and give thanks to those of y'all that always do. There's some that always be the first ones to check out the video, to seek to support the video, maybe give a little commentary. And yes, brothers and sisters, because there's been such a kind of a lack of kind of communication, sometimes we'll check the first set of comments that come in. Sometimes it's not too many comments that come in. Sometimes it's not too many likes. And what one is affecting is you're affecting, like what it says? It says appreciation. Appreciation. That's what helps the work. Encouragement sweetens labor. I don't know if you ever heard that before. Encouragement sweetens labor, right? Encouragement sweetens labor, right? Encouragement. Yo, give thanks to that video. Give thanks to that. Why don't you talk about this? Or I like what you said there, but the part I disagree with is here. Because some would just tell us about, it'll be one thing, and that's the all thing. And they might actually like other things, but they're not going to even tell you. I mean, I'm like, where did that come from? Right? You know what I mean? So the Rastafari movement, right? The silence of the voice of justice, right? And not just in global affairs, right? Because a lot of times you have a lot of our people, we're talking about all the political buzzword trending news, right? And you know what we, don't do, right? We don't speak about what about us, right? And then even communicate with one another, support and communicate to really build, and offering discipleship. And I know some have. I know we're very busy. Everybody got things that are going on. And I do want to show my appreciation, for those who have supported and those who do support, the work that is going on. I know it's very difficult. It's difficult times. But the Rastafari movement, is it still a movement? Or are we in a state of inertia? Rastafari movement or inertia, right? Where are we now? At one time there was the Africa, the so-called back to Africa, or the going to Africa, or at least building, right, bridges with Africa. They have resources, right? They might have things there that we don't have here. And we, of course, have things here that they don't have here. And building these relationships, with our co-religionists or others who are also Rastafari minded, with our co-laborers, right, and like-minded, individuals on the continent. You know what I'm saying? So the movement, the Rastafari movement, are we still a movement? Is things still moving? What we like to propose is the Rastafari community, right? And especially LOJ Society, seeks to propose, that we start to build this Rastafari community. What is community? A simple, etymological to an extent, right, view of the word community comes down to something of the order of common unity. Right? Common unity. Doesn't mean that we are united on everything. We're not clones or nothing like that. But it means that there are certain common denominators. Right? And we as Rastafari, or those who like to call yourselves Rasta, we still view those as our, potential brothers and sisters. Right? We have to have common, unity, because there are common denominators. See, by having, you'll do mathematics, and not mention physics a little earlier. People say, what is this, math, physics? This is all part of education. And we talk about we Rastafari, and Rastafari Makonnen, and that's Haile Selassie the first. And so what about the teaching of His Majesty? A lot of people can say Selassie I, Selassie I. We can say and all this and that, right? But when it comes down to the teachings and the mission, right? Ask most ones, what is the mission, right, of Haile Selassie? What's the real mission, right? What do we think our mission is? See, if there's no mission, there's been mission drift from that real mission, that earlier mission, and we can see that in what has happened to the movement when we look at it then and we look at it now, right? On so many related levels that we hope to be able to have, dialogue and discussion about these things and to produce content, right, in order to be able to disseminate, the learned and the valuable points and that which is not just useful but beneficial, right? Useful and beneficial, for our community. The roots of Rastafari, right? What is the roots of Rastafari? So here, get to the roots of Rastafari. The roots of Rastafari is, of course, the Lion of Judah, right? And the fullness of the Lion of Judah we're speaking about, Getachin, Jesus Christos, our Black Lord and Savior, the King of Kings Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, right? And in the manifestation, the revelation, weep not, behold, the conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, Kedamawi Haile Selassie, right? The elect of God, Siyumek Ziabi, Negusa Negasa, Ethiopia. All right, so a summary, right? A summary. This is the half of the story so that our public can be well informed, right? Dissemination of the true information. When we look at the Rastafari movement, we have pre-1930. Like you said, if we look up, like, okay, Rastafari, just look up Rastafari origins. I'll tell you, in Jamaica, 1930. This is the popular motif, right? And in a sense, that is very true, right? That the Rastafari movement, the big emergence that we see in the 1930s and onward, does come out of the Isle of Jamaica, right? But the real roots of that. So if we see what's happening in Jamaica, the Rastafari communities, many communities are under a real fight and a struggle down there. You know what I mean? And we would love to be able to do more, but we're on these front lines right here. But the ones in Jamaica, and even those brothers and others, I Congo, Hail Up, and so many other ones that are down there on the front lines because of this kind of global, geopolitical, we're in the world, but how this Babylonian, this system of things, the systemic, racism, the systemic discrimination, the systemic exploitation, right? Because, there's independence, Jamaican independence. Has this been better or worse? What's the state of the Rastafari communities? What are there Rastafari communities? I'm not talking about just the mansions, but how things have gotten so, so COINTELPRO'd. See, COINTEL, right, meant the counterintelligence. What we're giving you right here is intel. This is the half of the story. You can go look it up, right? Right. So we get the Rastafari movement, right? The time frame of the 30s, right? So often what is popularized is this right here, right? This is the part that's often popularized. So when you go search social media, maybe even AI will tell you that, they'll say, well, yeah, Rastafari, that's from Jamaica. That's from the 1930s because, it was with the coronation of Haile Selassie and how Haile Selassie was seen as a Messiah or the Messiah, and then there's spiritual practices, and they will also point to Jamaica. There's the communal reasonings that were, right, Nyabingi, right? There was other, we say, like precepts that developed because many of the early Rastafari, right, did not have beards, did not have locks. They were not beardsmen, locksmen, but then, as ones got into the Bible and also some of the, the revolutionary black people activities in Africa, the Mau Mau and others, and learning about the Bahitawi of Ethiopia, you know what I mean? So the locks come in also because of the Bible, Numbers chapter 6. So Numbers chapter 6, the biblical aspect, then the geopolitical liberation aspects that we see with the Mau Mau, as well as that we see with the Bahitawi, another spiritual aspect. So this now comes into the sense of the dreadlocks, the liberty, right? And then we get a kind of a formalization from Jamaica. I mean, a lot of our people, we don't deal with like religion in the sense of the Western Gentile religion, right? But because of lack of education, right, the word is avoided instead of the right word being, derived or used either from our Ethiopian teaching, because the word that's often used is hymenot. That means like living faith. But we do see a formalization of what loosely can be called a Rasta in the Rastafari movement. So we get like Bingi, Bobo, 12 tribes, of Israel. These are the movements that you often hear associated, but here's the problem with it. They would actually believe that that is the real origin of it. You see what I'm saying? So it is the not just misinformation, but it's the disinformation. And this is what we say, that this whole thing about COINTELPRO, it's not the COINTELPRO, right, of our ancestors that we're dealing with, right? A lot of the COINTELPRO is, many ones are putting forth information that they haven't really studied, right? They haven't really fact-checked, right? They haven't really read or resourced or even peer-reviewed. We are our peers. You know what I mean? So we need to have these dialogue and discussion, or others don't want to have a dialogue or discussion, you know, on these important points. You know, ones might have a platform and put out information, and maybe some of the information is information. Maybe some of it is disinformation. How do we peer review one another? Well, I'm just going to say what I'm going to say. I don't care what the next man is saying. So where's the community? You see how the movement got fractionalized and fractured, right? And I think that it was definitely between like the times after the martyrdom of ones like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh. These are like known ones that were very vocal and very public. And that's during the days of Reaganomics, you know, Ronald Reaganomics. You remember back to 81, right? That's when those things happened. September 11th is connected. Wow, it's so crazy when you think about the conspiracy that people believe and even can be substantiated with information, evidence, and facts in the world, and fail to see, right, how these same signs were being used against, right, you know, that remnant, right, once lost, now found, right, the beta Israelites, right, of the Western Hemisphere. So here we go right here. I want to bring this out right here, all right? So the theme, right? Now this is the origin, pre-1930. So that means that the original Rastafari movement, right, that light shining from the east to the west, as the scripture mentioned, was the Son of Man, right, the true human being, yes, so lich, right? We have that pre-1930s, circa 1919, right, into the 1920s, into what's known as the Roaring Twenties. Now think about that. We're already 100 years, right? We're more than the halfway mark, 100 years after what occurred in Chicago and New York and in the United States of America. So the real origin, right, of the Rastafari movement in the West. So the Rastafari movement, right, Rastafari movement or inertia. So the real origin of the Rastafari movement in the West was not Jamaica, but Jamaica became, I can say, a big catalyst, right? You know, I see Jamaica and the rise of the Rastafari in Jamaica, although it came after the origins of the movement here in the Americas as the first Rasta, Lenin Percival Howell so said, but it became a way of almost like life support. Life support for this movement, right? You see? And what we need to understand is that there can't really be a divide, right? If there's a divide against our own brothers, right? This is why we got to look out, right? And this, of course, doesn't make us popular among other FBAers. But you know what? We've been able to influence certain ones that have been had a zeal. Once we gave them some knowledge, you know, like it says in the Bible, they have a zeal, right? But it's not according to knowledge. Once we gave certain FBAers that we've been having like private and, you know, personable conversation, they'll share their information, we share ours, you know, we show where we agree, but then we point out the crucial facts, right, that the popular FBA movement is not addressing, right? And we can't help to think that this is a level of COINTELPRO, right, to divide and conquer us, when our whole history as so-called black people in the Americas and the Caribbean, the Caribbean, has been so interrelated, right, for this whole 400 years. So you mean because some of our people ignorantly speak against reparations, right? Because we've seen some of the arguments. Well, you know, there's some people who are not foundational black Americans, 400 years in America, you know what I mean? But then there's a lot of things that we have neglected of our own heritage, like the origin of the Rastafarites here in these here United States, and how that led, right, to other, movements and other moving forward, right, straight till we get like through the 60s and the civil rights, and then it's where we hit the affirmative action wall, bang, right? Circa the 1970s, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Great Society, right? Then we reach the 80s, the martyrdom of ones like Burhana Selassie and Peter Tosh, right? And then we in the 80s, what do we get? We get the NWA, right? Niggas with attitudes, right? So we can see what was going on with the destruction, right, of black communities and families that led to the gang, and the bang bang in the 80s and the NWAs, right? And then we come into the 90s, the crack epidemic. You see the brokenness, and now we got gentrification, but we wouldn't have the gentrification the way it was if our communities wasn't busted down and broken. And our communities only got busted down and broken because of mission drift. We took our eye, right, as black people, right? Black people in the Americas and the Caribbean. Now, the fellow disciples, Talmudim, this is how we've been saying it for years. We see people picking up on a lot of, popular, saying and rhetoric and certain key point, and then they kind of spin it their own way. But we're talking about the black people here. We as black people, we represent the black people, right? Here, when I say the black people, we represent our people amongst the black people here in the Americas and the Caribbean. And when we say Americas, we mean North America, mainly and namely, but also inclusive of South America, and we can say everywhere between the Caribbean as well, right? Let it be known, right? So we do have firm and strong positions on some things that some might find offensive, some might find it to be similar to what they've heard from some of the so-called FBAs, but what that is a COINTELPRO. People don't really recognize that's a counterintelligence thing going on. You see what I'm saying? See, people will talk about COINTELPRO and they say, no, Yadin, you're wrong. COINTELPRO was just Gay Edgar Hoover or J. Edgar Hoover. No, you wrong. See, you have to understand, COINTELPRO, that was an operation that had the name of counterintelligence. But counterintelligence, it is a battle strategy. It's a war strategy. It's like, disinformation, giving misinformation. You know what I mean? It's part of the art of war, right? And what a lot of our people don't recognize is that not only have the lost sheep been in a particular, how can we say, under these consequences for disobedience here in these Americas and the Caribbean from our true identity. You know what I mean? What is our true identity, right? But now we're battling, a COINTELPRO that's actually in blackface, right? And seeking to divide and conquer us, right? Over some real nonsense issues as though we are different people. We got idiots on both sides, right? And so I want to show you this for a moment, get into this a little more. We got idiots on both sides. What do I mean by idiots on both sides? I mean, we got some black people who say certain things about our brothers and sisters from the Caribbean or so-called West Indians as a pejorative to some. Some think of it as a pejorative, and we can understand if you're amongst those some that think of it like that. You know what I mean? And sometimes it's not even a harm thing, but it's just how, we have I remember growing up, West Indies, the West Indians, but it wasn't like, it was like, it's like saying my people from, my Geechee people vis-a-vis my Gullah people. In other words, my people in North Carolina vis-a-vis my people in South Carolina, my people in Atlanta, my people in Bama, or my people, you know what I'm saying? So they're different hoods, so to speak. But it's not as though, you see, look how many, even the gang situation was another divide and conquer. But now that we're in this political, social media, now some of these things are being politicalized, right? And now we have this divide and conquer amongst our people. But amongst all this, what about the Rastafari movement, right? Where's the Rastafari movement, right? And I suspect that the Rastafari movement is in this state of inertia because we've forgotten half of the story. And by forgetting half of the story, it's easy to get into mission drift. right? So most would tell you about, right here, they'll tell you about this half of the story, that yeah, Rastafari began in Jamaica in the 1930s, right? But actually, right, Rastafari began right here in the West, right, in the Americas, right, in Chicago, New York, right, in the pre-1930s. So we got to understand what's going on here, right? That means that we who represent the right 1930s from the roots here as Black Americans here, cannot neglect right the Jamaica Rastafari and Caribbean contribution to the movement. But here's the thing: most of our people from our last posts and some of our recent posts have just learned that they didn't even know, right, about, right, the pre-1930s Rastafari. They did not know about the origins, right, of the Rastafarites. All they knew about is the Jamaican Rasta movement. Right? See, we have to get to origins, right? So it's not saying that, well, one side of it is better than the other side. What we're saying is that the two sevens, the two sevens got to clash. The two hands got to meet, right? We need a handshaking here, right? A handshaking, like I'm holding your hand and you need me to pull you up, or vice versa, right? And we must, right, both instill in ourselves, right, and our children and our descendants and our fellows, this fundamental unifying idea that we Black peoples here in the Americas and the Caribbean are one people. And all this so-called tether, the real tethering is being tethered to white supremacy, is being tethered, right, to even white America. Right? Stay tuned for that next one. I want to get right into that because I've been musing on this for a moment, and we have shared some very good dialogue and conversation. I'm trying to give, the viewers right here, the essence and the substance of this. So when we look at the origins of the Rastafari movement, right, the origins of the Rastafari movement, right, in the West. The origins of the Rastafari movement in the West, it's pre-1930, all from 1919, right, to the 1920s, right? The focus of the origins of the Rastafari movement in Chicago, right, New York, some of these cities, but the main cities like Chicago primarily, and in even the secondary sense, New York, in these here United States of America, right? The focus was Ethiopian allegiance, right? Pan-African identity. But the Ethiopian allegiance, this is just a simple overview right here. To give you a little footnote right here, is linked with our Israelite, identity, right? It's definitely linked right there with our Israelite biblical identity, right? That's right. Now, key activities, right, was the flag symbolism, right? Now, we just touched on, we had, what was it? It was on the Tetzaveh, the Torah portion. I think it was on the Thursday Upper Room of Zion podcast from the 26th, 27th. You might find it listed because we start like in the early hours, sometime of the morning in this season right here. So you'll find it like on the 27th, February 27th, but it's the Upper Room of Zion. Look for that live right there. It's a rather long live. If you can scroll through it, you can find the part. I think it's maybe after the first hour, first hour or so. Be that as it may, we're speaking of the flag, right? How he has given a banner to those that reverence, respect him, that may be displayed because of the truth, the banner of salvation. So we talk about the Moa and Bessa, the Lion of Judah flag, right? Also Ethiopian nationalism, right? And this was not just based on political things, but it's based on digesting biblical truth, right? And looking at what is biblical, right? And lining that up with us and our identity as a people, right? And history and what was right now, right then, right? So these are key aspects, and the relation was proto ideas, right? Of Ethiopian, and probably should say Ethiopianism right here, right? We'll get this updated of Ethiopianism right here, because this is one of the slides, one of the presentations right here, to begin a conversation, right, around about this right here, right? A conversation around this right here, the true story, right, this summary right here, the true story, right, of the origins of the Rastafarites. This was the forerunner of what later will become the Jamaican Rasta movement. Now, the Jamaican Rasta movement, it reminds me of the Black Hebrew Israelites, or the Hebrew Israelites rather, right? As some don't like the BHIs, but the Hebrew Israelites. Many people look at the Hebrew Israelites movement that has gotten mad populous in social media of the late, you could say 90s, but even more so coming into 2000 and the proliferation of social media, that people don't even remember that even before 1969 and ISUPK, right, there were, some say the real Israelites, but there was the real Israelite movement too, right, that goes all the way back, right, to like the commandment keepers, the congregation of the living God, right, Royal Order of the Ethiopian Hebrews, goes all the way back to the 20s and goes all the way back to the same origins of the Rastafari. So the Israelite movement and the Rastafarites movement have a common denominator. There's that common denominator, right? Because it basically was one movement, right? Some may have gravitated more, like many of those who were of the Rastafarites, right, would gravitate more many times to the, you could say the Israelite, to the like commandment keepers, the black Jews, of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Lion of Judah Society. And now here's where we come in, brothers and sisters and brothers, and where you come in as well. So here, that little summary right there, the Rastafarites. This is what we rep right here, what LOJ, Lion of Judah Society represents, right? We rep this because this is our foundation. This is our true foundation, as Rastafari, right? With the origin of the Rastafari movement, right, in the West. The origins of the Rastafari movement. When I say the origin of Rastafari, we know is the East. Look to the East, right? But where that seed, right? And that seed by Leonard Percival Howell, right? The Jamaican, right, brother, our Jamaican brother that they call the first Rasta, right? He's the one that took that seed, right? Planted that, right, in Jamaica, right? And from that seed, you know what I'm saying? From that bud, it budded so many buds, right? And so many of these buds that were budded is so very important, right? Within the preservation and perpetuation of the Rastafari movement. But then the inertia, right? We come to that point of inertia, right? See, it's like having gas in your car, right? And as long as you got that gas in your car, you can keep moving. But when the gas runs out, right, you're going to run on empty and there's not going to be any more movement. Is that what has happened to the Rastafari movement? And we're not talking about like, okay, there's reggae shows, we go to a reggae show and music and we play music. That's all part of it, but that's more like the accessories to the real movement. Because, there's some that will say, no, what are you talking about? No, the Rastafari movement is vibrant. Like over in our area, we have a lot of shows and stuff like that. Okay, what comes from that show? I mean, shows and other events, public events and artists, is very, very important, right? But the only one in a long time, probably since Bob Marley, that we've seen that really, whose shows, right, really, right, combine not only the music and one can say the performative or entertainment value, but real substance, was the late, great Vaughn Benjamin, right? Was the late, great Vaughn Benjamin, a.k.a. Ake Becca, right? Also known as Midnight, you know what I'm saying? Well, that's the band name, but also known as Midnight. Hail up Rod Seymour as well, Seymour Liberd. Yes, I hail up Grove, the St. Croix people as well, because you see, Rastafari, right? The real Rastafari, as His Majesty says, we can't be content just to follow trends or wait for. No, we have to, we have to pathfind. Like make a way out of no way. Because when you see what's going on, it's like, like all the paths, right, have been lost. Therefore, there's no movement. You know what I mean? There's no movement, like run out of gas. Bob Marley, Haile Selassie, he kind of alluded to this in something, there was an interview. Some of you might have heard the interview, right? He says like the fire, interviewer asks him about the fire revolution. It's like the fire revolution just going out, and Haile Selassie, Bob Marley said it's a trick, right? And he even said that ones and ones would rise up and they would like protest for the system. Now, the Bible tells you the same thing, where it says Babylon is a cage of every foul and filthy bird. So some people are going to actually try to defend, right? They're being tethered to the system. So what, we was here in America for 400 years, right? We know what we went through. Some have even forsaken, whatever so-called relationship, right, they have with our peoples on the continent called today Africa. They want to reject that. Right? They want to totally reject that and say, well, our only roots and origin over here, I ain't African. I don't got no African in me, because of their negative encounter, right? Perhaps with some of the different African tribes, right? Or ethnicities that they have encountered over here, right? Even if they've encountered Ethiopians of this latter day, just as we today are not, right, of the same, and this is sad to even say, but of the same caliber, right, as our ancestors going back 100 years ago, back to 1925, 1926, right? Because here we're in 2026. Think about that. Think about what I'm saying right here, right? See, just 100 years. Look at how much has changed over 100 years, right? Look at, our communities then. Sure, we may not have had. The big difference between today is that, well, we got like millionaires, right? Ones are making a lot of money, a lot of paper. I'm not saying everybody, but you know what I'm saying? We have more like vanity, or you see their faces on TV, social media, they're glam, they're living their life in the image of the beast, to maximum effect, right? Somebody even said that they're into reparations. Right, not into group reparations. There's something to be, what you think about that idea. I know a lot of people say, no, we need to get it as a group. But see, in order to get something as a group, it means that we have to be a group. We have to be a community. But if there's no real black community, you know what I'm saying? If ones don't, how can I say? Christ said, you could tell who are my people by how much love they have one for another, right? A lot of we or others as Black Americans, we can talk about a lot of different groups, but I want to heal up, what's his name, Ringo. He said something, one of his thing about, like his experience about being black in America, right? Because I listened to Next Man's testimony, and some things I definitely can say, that's true, I agree, and then it makes me say, well, I get your testimony, I receive it, but this is my testimony. This is my story. This is my song, right? So the Rastafari movement actually, right, and the movement in the West, right, actually started in Chicago, USA, Chicago and New York. This is like the kind of the twin areas, but it seemed as though on the streets of Chicago, when we look at the historical narrative, what's easily documented, right, and referenceable, right? Leonard Howell, right, he said something, right, that was, very interesting, right? He told the Jamaican Gleaner, that he got his tenets for what would become very popular and rooted, right? See, Rastafari took roots in Jamaica, right, from Leonard Percival Howell, right, who was attracted, as he says, to the Rastafarites, right? And Leonard Percival Howell, he never called himself Rasta, right? That's something that later day generations have done, right? They've abbreviated their glory. Stop abbreviating your glory to be loved, right? Stop teaching evildoers, your ways. You know what I'm saying? Plain and simple, right? So there's no more, this is not a mystery, brothers and sisters. We have it documented, right? Teaching the true history, right? For almost 2 decades now, right? And it's very interesting, the real Rastafari movement, right? Or at least the origin of the Rastafari movement in the West, it started in Chicago. So see what happened? So Leonard Percival Howell, he got it there, right? Even though he's from Jamaica, right? He's up here in America, and there's none of this FBA nonsense. There's none of this nonsense that we see today. Our people are working together, right? And it's true that we've gone through a lot over the past 100 years, right? And many of us, wasn't back there in the 1920s, wasn't there in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Some of us may be born late 60s, some may be born in the 70s, some of you are born in the 80s, some in the 90s, some of them was born in the 2010s, right? The first 10, right? Some may have been born in the next 10, and some are being born right now, right? Ain't that something, right? But what we're speaking about right here, right, from Chicago to Harlem, right? Black Americans, right? Unbeknownst to themselves, they founded a movement, and something was lost, right? Both from the Rastafari movement neglecting this, right? Half of the story that hasn't been told, right? Right? That aspect, that there, you know what I'm saying? And right from ourselves as so-called Black Americans, right? And it's so interesting because the Rastafari movement, one could even say that the Rastafari, this is what's so interesting about it, right? Because a lot of ones are trying to represent as fact what derives from ignorance, right, envy or error, right? And a lot of ones not pushing this. A lot of the different popular Rastafari groups that might be Jamaican are not pushing this information, right? Because they think it's going to take away from them. This is not to take away. Nothing can take away from that, man. What's a guan? What are you talking about? What it be like here during this Black History Month, right? The so-called shortest month, right? We have to get the movement moving again, right? But it all begins with the truth, is knowing the truth. See, the truth is like that fuel. You see, the truth, remember the example about the car running out of fuel? The truth is like that fuel. You know what I mean? It's like that fuel, right? It's like getting gas back in the tank. You know what I mean? Okay, now we can move. You know what I'm saying? We don't have no gas, we run out, right? And we just get stuck. We're trying to reach over to the next city, but we don't have enough gas to get to the city. So now we're stuck like in the wilderness, right? So let's move the movement again, but the movement can only, it's both, not just the moving of it, but uniting our community, uniting ourselves in common purpose, right? Learning about our roots over here as the Rastafarites, right? Embracing and communicating with our brothers and sisters, especially in the Americas, the South America, also the Caribbean. So it's not only our brothers and sisters, right, in the Caribbean, but also extending it to our brothers and sisters in South America, right? Now, there's this thing like Africa Dea, right? Africa Dea. But you see, Africa, right, only has been able, right, to even endure and keep a lot of sustainability, even though Africa is going through a lot of different things. We know what's going on different levels, right? But because of Black Americans, many of them admit that what we were doing over here in the West and showing in this North country inspired our movements across Africa, right? Across Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, to East Africa, right? But also South Africa. Hail up to our communities in South Africa. Hail up to the Israelite communities in South Africa, especially to the Israelite communities, right? Sub-Saharan African, communities, South African communities that acknowledge themselves as Israelite. Hail up to this brother Kedal as well. Want to hear him up as well. You know, this is Yad and Rasta Adonis Tafari, you know, because we reached out to these ones and ones. But brothers and sisters, this is the question. What do you think? Has the Rastafari movement gone into inertia? There's a brother of mine, Black American brother, I think he was in the Nation of Gods and Earths, so-called 5% the nation. And this is about maybe almost 3 decades ago, right? More than 2. You know, we would always be having these reasonings, right? And it was very interesting reasoning. It's about going on 2 decades, actually. Going on 2 decades. You have these reasonings, and he would be talking about inertia. Inertia, that was a big reasoning, right? Inertia, right? And I really remember those reasonings, right? Because it was like, you know, like inertia, how inertia and movement is 2 different things, right? But that when something that is moving, right, gets into inertia, right, it's the most dangerous area because it's almost like death, basically. It's like death. Now, we're not saying this about the Rastafari movement. There's a lot of vibrancy, right, to Rastafari, to the individuals and one, but it's those unifying common denominators, right? Getting to those common denominators, you know, that transcends, you know, maybe like personal, you know, subjective. You know, there's a lot of subjective, but we need to like look at the objective, you know, because we have to keep our aim and our objects, you know, objectives, you know, objectively speaking. Because if we can look at it like that, right, then our road to both uniting our community, right, as well as moving the movement, you know what I mean, according to the mission, right? See, in order to understand what the real Rastafari mission really is, right? Like for example, in Jamaica, right, there's a lot of things that the Jamaican Rastas, you know, Rastafari, you know, Jamaican Rastas are seeking to do. There's a lot of things, you know, and there's a lot of, you know, things that they're up against. But a large part of it, right, is the disorder, this unity, dysfunction, right, the disinformation, the misinformation that many times comes out from our own community, or amongst our own community, right, you know, and that's what we have to deal with. Just like we as Black Americans, we got a lot of issues, right, and we as, you know, Black American Rastafari, you know, it's no way to really quantify or, you know, to quantify it, right? But no doubt we are kind of a minority. And you know what happens to a lot of us who are Black American Rastafari? Many of our own Black American people, you know, they see us, oh, you must be Jamaican, or you must be from the Caribbean. And many have been kind of surprised, oh, you're a Black American? You know, they're like, you Black American? Oh, you FBA, yeah, you FBA. You know, but then they wonder, like, but you got the locks. What's up with the locks? But then, you know, a lot of our Black American youth, especially coming through the 90s, that really blew up, right? Some of us, when we started to grow our locks, you know, we had to go through persecution, right? And we fought against it, right? You know, we pushed back against a lot of these, you know, that's back in like the late 80s and the 80s and the 90s, right? And we were so successful with that now you see everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people wearing locks, all kind of locks, you know, and many of them are not Rastafari, right? At one time when you saw someone wearing locks, that was Rastafari. So what that proves is that we were so successful, right, in defending our human right to our, you know, religious and cultural expressions of such things as locks. Many of you all know about the prison ministry, defending the rights of our brothers and sisters, and we need more support from our Rastafari community, right, on the prisoners' mission. You know, these are the main areas that are important to our namesake, right? Kadamawi Haile Selassie. But as we said, there's been a mission drift. There's been a lot of mission drift from the mission of His Majesty. A lot of ones are getting into a kind of it's almost like a kind of pseudo-religious thing. While saying that they're not a religion, right, they become pseudo-religious. Right, because when we start to talk about, you know, geopolitical, economical things, cultural, social things, right, uniting, you know, our diasporas, right, in different locations. We're just Black people in different locations. So having that some of us, our roots here, you know, over 400 years is predominantly a majority in America, right, while others have their roots over roughly that said period of time in the Caribbean, right? And others in South America, right? And then we have our other brothers and sisters across the Ethiopian Ocean. Oh, you know it as they changed the name to the South Atlantic or the Atlantic Ocean, but over the Ethiopian Ocean, right? But how can we say we want to unite with our brothers over there? And from what I see from our communities from down south, South Africa, going all the way up, especially, on the east, look to the east, they're very much, and even other parts of Africa, they're very much more are united in their communities. And that shows us that there's something else that's going on, right, to divide and conquer us, right? And I call that, right, the hidden COINTELPRO, right, project. People say, well, it's over. They disbanded that. That's over. That's a thing of the past. No, counterintelligence is not a thing of the past. Because if it was a thing of the past, then ones would have already known about what I'm showing you right here. Right? And if what I'm showing you right here is not significant enough, right, for ones to do their own research, repost it, support ones like Balanta, right, our brother Sifaway, and so many others, well, a few others, right, that are really pushing this particular agenda. But more ones are picking up on it, right, and therefore there's hope. You know what I mean? We can eagerly look forward to the moving forward. Right? But the first thing is, we got to get out of this inertia, right? Behold how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Look at even within this right here, right? This example of even brothers, right, able to dwell together, right? Brothers able to be together. You see that right there, right? That's something that we really don't see so much right now, right? That's all part of the divide and conquer. Right, the divide and conquer, and this whole FBA thing is a very clever. It's very clever. You know what I mean? It's very clever. What does it? Be wise as serpent, harmless as dove. Being wise as a serpent, we can see that, and I hope you're able to see that, right, and also respond to that and recognize that, so one doesn't get fooled out. Don't be like simple-minded. When you see this disinformation circulating around there. And also recognize that a lot of our people, right, this is probably the first time they've gotten into any, right, really serious real-world information, right, whether about being abos or being this or being that. There was something I was going to share, but I think I'll pick up on that as we do a little bit more on this, because we're already past an hour on this. I thought this would be a couple of minutes, but I really hope and pray, that this has kind of edified or informed, you on more, and more teaching and more reasonings like this. Then please be sure to like the video. Be sure to share the video. If you can, give a comment, an emoji, or something, because encouragement sweetens labor, and also with other content providers out there as well, especially within our community. But we got to think as community again, right? Because there is no black community as there was. It's been broken down. We've gone through too much, right? How can we say warfare, right? In here in America, this warfare that's torn down. When we talk about gentrification and all these things, and the broken families, and broken communities. So there's a lot of brokenness that we have experienced, right, over, right, the past 100 years, right, till we get back to the roots of this, right, the Rastafarites, the roots of the Rastafari movement here in this Western Hemisphere, right. So movement or inertia, right, the origins of the Rastafari movement in the West. I think that's a good title right there to go with. And, Yeshua Shalom, Yesu Salam, Isis Salam, Yesu Salam, Rastafari, Yeshua Shalom, brothers and sisters. Oh, before we go, this here, we'll probably do a whole video on this. This right here is a lie, right? The origins and birth of Rastafari. How could that be so? The man born there with Ethiopia, this man was born there, right? That's Psalm 87 verse 4, right? This is a lot of disinformation, right? There's a lot of disinformation, right? We understand, many of us do understand, right? You know, understanding the geopolitical, social situation of our brothers and sisters within the Isle of Jamaica under the British. They've been under that Brit shit for a long time. A lot of them been under it so long they don't even know they're under it. You know what I'm saying? That's being under something a long time. And look at the sister's face. You know, there's some anger there, right? And use that anger because there's some ignorance. And part of that ignorance is being put out right here. That Rastafari emerged, but then you say the birth of Rastafari? Are you serious? Right? Are you serious? Right? And if you notice through this whole write-up right here, there's no mention about the true origin of the movement. They're going to go back to Marcus Garvey's prophecy, and it wasn't even Marcus Garvey's prophecy. The name they should be talking about is Reverend James Morris Webb. They should be talking about Reverend James Morris Webb. What they should be talking about is James Morris Webb, right? So when one's talking about establishing nationality and sovereignty, how can you do it, right? How can you do it and leave out, right? Leave out the other half of the story, right? The Rastafarites, right? The Black American Rastafari, that origin. How can you tell our story and leave us out of the story that you are telling, right? How can you do that, right? And not expect for it to bust down, for it to break down. And this is what we're going through right now. And we're hoping that this is a temporary thing, right? But it all depends on how people respond to the truth, right? It's like with the Moshiach, the Messiah, and speaking the truth. Either ones can be reformed, you know what I mean? You know, ones can repent, ones can, you know, change mind and, you know, change their mind and go from the astray way into the right way. Or one can become hardened in going that wrong way. It's like saying, hey, wait, if you keep speeding that way, there's a cliff there. You know what I mean? If they don't listen, then they're going to go off. You know what I mean? They're going to go off, right? And we hope that ones get turned on because there's a great potential. You know what I mean? But, you know, all thanks and praise be. But I just wanted to show you when they say the origins and birth. I said, birth? Really? The birth of Rastafari? I mean, you say that with a straight face? That's wild, right? But notice, as I was talking about before, where they say it emerged in Jamaica. So you see, it's like speaking like with forked tongue. Is it the birth of Rastafari or the emergence? You see what I'm saying? The emergence, right? What's so interesting, and this is the funniest thing, brothers and sisters, is that our majority factual documentation that confirms that the first Rasta, right, was only the first Rasta of Jamaica and not the first Rasta, because that first Rasta had encountered, right, the Rastafarites, right, of USA, Chicago, right? That's what happened there, right? That's the half of the story, right? The true origins of the Rastafari movement. And this is another proof positive. This is a tell right here. Here we see the black Jews, we the black Jews of Harlem, along with the UNIA, and some of the early actual Rastafarites, right? Some of the early Rastafarites. You can see right here, right, they are carrying, right, two pictures, right? Let me show you this right here, right? They're carrying these two pictures. Notice this right here. You see the two pictures they're carrying? They're carrying the pictures of Rastafari, and they're carrying a picture of Marcus Messiah Garvey. You note that right there? They're carrying, so on the left-hand side, right, is Rastafari. This is pre-coronation, right? So the words and the prophecy of Reverend James Morris Webb, right, in 1930, when Jamaica and elsewhere saw, remember it was already prophesied, right, by our prophets up here in this North Country, North America, like Reverend James Morris Webb, right, and the Rastafarites, they already are like the handwriting on the wall. Then, when ones like Leonard Percival Howell went there, built the community, you had ones like Marcus Garvey, they were somewhat adversarial, right? When I say adversarial, because Marcus Garvey, he wanted to block that word of Rastafari, right? After embracing it, right? You know, it goes back to like the John the Baptist syndrome, right? Because why wasn't John the Baptist, why didn't he become a follower of Jesus Christ, right? Why did he have to say, are you the one that we look for, or do we look for another, right? It makes you wonder. It becomes like a lot of the diverse doctrine that Garvey said right before the end. But this is at the time earlier, because you have to remember what happened with John the Baptist and Jesus Christ, right? It's like John the Baptist, he recognized who Jesus Christ was. You know what I mean? He definitely recognized. He said, I'm not worthy to unlace. He said, I shouldn't be baptizing you. He was like, almost he needs to be baptized of Messiah. And Messiah said, just do this. But then later on, he would have the boldness and audacity to say, do we look for you? Well, I mean, are you the one we look for, or do we look for another? Because he was in prison, incarcerated, right? Does this sound familiar, right? Garvey, right, as well. So this is here us just showing certain roots, right? Some of the half of the story that hasn't been told. And for ones that want to see the Daily Gleaner article, right, Saturday, November 23rd, 1940, right? So remember, it's in this article that Leonard Howell says that he first became attracted to, right, the teachings of Rastafari and to Rastafari from the Rastafarites, right, of the USA, namely Chicago and New York and other areas. And then he took that back, right, when he went to Jamaica, right? And so he is the reason why they say the first Rasta. So he's the first Jamaican Rastafari, and he's the origin of what we can say is like the Jamaican Rastafari movement. You know what I'm saying? Right? That basically bounced off of the movement that was already here, right, in these here United States of America. So it's important to understand that history. See, we can unite if we can admit the truth of this. Then there's a lot of unity there, right? Then we can start to repair, what has been broken down through these, years, if not decades, of disinfo, right, or apathy, right, or inertia, right? How the movement, has almost grounded, to like almost like we're in like a frozen psychological state, right? Not moving forward, right? Not moving back. I thought the whole movement was supposed to be about Africa. We hear ones like Muta Baruka. Yeah, he might have been and he traveled here and there. He might have a house here or there, but it's kind of very interesting, when we think about what the tenets of the movement actually were and what a lot of ones, especially a lot of elders who hold themselves out as elders and spokesmen, what they're really speaking about. They're speaking about Rastafari in a subjective sense, and it's like they've forgotten all about the objective of Rastafari. They talk about, it's a liberation movement. Well, liberation is a part of the whole thing, right? But part of the whole thing, right, is establishing community, right? And Rastafari about the truth, right? And this truth that we keep putting before you, right? And many ones want to ignore, right, or suppress. This is where you people and the good people, right, and the willing people liking and sharing and subscribing is very, very much a part of it. And those of you that are able to do content, right, do some content on this as well, right? But here's where we're going to seal up with this one right here. So, movement or inertia, right? Movement or inertia, right? The true origins of the Rastafari movement here in the West, and why it matters, all right? So Yeshua Shalom, y'all. Give thanks.
Lion of Judah Society.